Today, I want to begin by considering where Sha'ul and Barnabas are deciding to make a return visit to the communities they had founded in central Galatia. But before they set out on their journey from Antioch in Syria, they became locked in a dispute over Yochanan, known as John Mark. Barnabas wanted to take him with them, while Sha'ul objected, seeing that Yochanan had dropped out of their previous journey. Unable to agree over Yochanan, Barnabas took Yochanan and headed off to Cyprus, while Sha'ul took Sila and headed in the opposite direction through the inland road through Syria to Sicilia. So today I'm going to look at chapter 16 and part of this chapter 17, because the journey was so detailed it needs to be considered over 2 weeks. So this week I want to start with Sha'ul leaving Antioch and finish with him sailing down the coast of Macedonia towards Athens. Chapter 15 closes with Sha'ul and Sila setting off from Antioch and heading overland to Galatia. But before they reached the cities that they'd visited on Sha'ul's first journey, they had to pass through Tarsus, the city where he was born. Luke makes no mention of Sha'ul passing through Tarsus or any of the other towns and cities in the province of Sicilia. Instead, he opens in chapter 16, passing through Derbe and arriving at Lystra. While at Lystra, during his first visit, he'd been stoned and left for dead. But there was no mention of that event. Instead, Luke turns his attention to Sha'ul meeting with Timothy, whose mother, of course, was Jewish, but his father was Greek. That means that by modern traditional standards, Timothy would have been considered Jewish, even though he was not circumcised on the 8th day. Luke also says that Timothy was well respected by all the brothers in the region, and Timothy himself was actually a member of the Messianic community. So Sha'ul invited him to accompany him on his journey along with Sila. However, Sha'ul realized that he had a dilemma, because before he could take Timothy on the journey, he had to be circumcised, because it was common knowledge that his father was Greek. Yet, he had just told everybody that someone like Timothy did not need to be circumcised to become part of the Messianic community. But Timothy was a case which was different. For him to be accepted as a genuine supporter of Sha'ul and be accepted as a Jewish man, he indeed had to have Brit Milah done as an adult. In the Messianic community, his mixed parentage was not a problem because of the decision of the Jerusalem Council. But by joining with Sha'ul on his journey, unbelieving Jews would not accept Timothy as a Jew unless he had had Brit Milah. Also, alongside those unbelieving Jews, many of the believing Jews who had already come to become part of the Messianic community may well have also held to the same belief that Timothy could not be recognized as a Jew without being circumcised. So having had Timothy circumcised, Sha'ul and Sila, along with Timothy, set out westward to Poseidon, Antioch. As Luke says in verse 6, they travelled through the region of Galatia and westward, but they had been prevented by the Ruach HaKodesh from speaking the message out in the province of Asia. That verse suggests that the whole western region of Anatolia, which today is Turkey, was what Luke was referring to as the province of Asia. So then the question must be asked, why would the Ruach prevent them from speaking in such a broad region of the western Anatolia? Luke does not give any answer. But if we look at the first letter of Kepha, we see that much of the western part of Anatolia was the region where Kepha reached out during his teaching missions to the Jews of the diaspora. Kepha opens his first letter by addressing people as the chosen people living in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, and the province of Asia, and Bithynia. Then in verse 2, Kepha goes on to refer to his audience as the chosen, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, and set apart by the Spirit for obeying Yeshua as the Messiah, and for the sprinkling of understanding the sprinkling of his blood. So we see from those words that Kepha, at some stage during his career as an emissary, had worked among those Jewish communities in the northern part of Anatolia. So it makes sense that the Ruach would direct Sha'ul away from that region. So returning to Acts chapter 16, looking at verses 7 and 8, Luke continues speaking about the message from the Ruach, where he says, when they came to the frontier of Mysia, they tried to go to Bithynia, but the Spirit of Yeshua would not let them. So they passed on from Mysia and came down to Troas. The reason the Spirit of Yeshua, that is the Ruach, blocked them from proclaiming Yeshua in the western Anatolian region may be what Sha'ul was reflecting upon much later when he wrote in Romans chapter 15 verse 20, where he said, I have always made it my ambition to proclaim the good news where the Messiah was not yet known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. If that's true, that would explain why Sha'ul had been prevented from speaking in western Anatolia. In verses 9 and 10, a vision appeared to Sha'ul that same night. A man from Macedonia was standing and begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. As soon as he has seen the vision, we lost no time in getting ready to leave for Macedonia, for we concluded that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. So they set sail from Troas and headed northward. As we see, from Troas they headed towards Philippi. But on the way they passed what we know as Anzac Cove, which of course was the great First World War Battle of Gallipoli, where many New Zealanders of course died. Arriving at Macedonian Philippi, which is not to be confused with Caesarea Philippi, because the latter was where the transfiguration of Yeshua took place, and that one is in the northern region of Galilee. But Macedonian Philippi was a leading Roman city in eastern Macedonia, where Luke says Sha'ul met with a minion outside the city on the river bank, which appears to have been the location of the local synagogue. David Stern says in his commentary that the local synagogue may well have been located close to the riverbank, so that the river itself would be used as a mikveh, or immersion bath. Normally, the synagogue would have been located somewhere inside the city. However, during the reign of Emperor Claudius, Jews were expelled from Rome. Therefore, the same expulsion may well have impacted on the Jews in Philippi. The expulsion of the Jews under Claudius was confirmed by Luke again in Acts chapter 18 verse 2. Another interesting feature that emerges during this journey is how Luke, from Acts chapter 16 verse 17 right through to chapter 20 verse 5, speaks about Sha'ul, Sila and Timothy by using the words we, which implies that even Luke himself may well have been travelling with them as a reporter and a physician. During the riverside gathering, there were many women present with whom Sha'ul spoke, and particularly one woman, Lydia, who had originally come from Thyatira in western Anatolia. Here we see, yet again, how the Ruach opened the mind and heart of that Gentile woman. She understood what Sha'ul was teaching and responded by accepting Yeshua into her life and was immediately immersed. However, becoming a member of the Messianic community, she decided then to invite Sha'ul and the others in his party to lodge at her house for the duration of the time that they spent in Philippi. And during their stay in Philippi, Sha'ul and the others regularly were plagued by a slave girl who possessed a snake spirit, enabling her to act as a fortune teller, or as we might call it today, a psychic seer. Powerful as their words can be, the demons know that they are ultimately going to have to submit to the authority of Yeshua as the Mashiach. That is why, when expelling the demon from the girl, Sha'ul did not address the girl, but only the demon. He did not speak on his own authority either, but on the authority of Yeshua himself. That was the last thing the unbelieving Jews of the community of Philippi needed. They wanted peace among the Romans. So they would be quite happy for Sha'ul and Sila to be found guilty of causing a riot. The judges finally agreed to have them flogged and chained overnight. Once again, the power of God intervened with a natural event. As my title image showed, the earthquake shook the whole region, releasing Sha'ul and Sila from the prison bondage. But rather than escape, they presented themselves to the jailer, who was so fearful at what had happened, and expecting the worst, he was about to kill himself. But realizing the magnitude of what had occurred, the jailer said to them, "Men, what must I do to be saved?" Luke says he washed their wounds and fed them, and then along with the rest of his family immersed themselves and became trusters in Yeshua. The following morning, possibly as a result of the earthquake, or more likely a direct touch from the Ruach itself, the judges sent police officers to the prison to release them and dispatch them quietly out of the town without any fuss. But Sha'ul called upon his Roman citizenship by drawing attention to the fact that he had been flogged in public without having been accused of any crime. Doubtless the city authorities and the judges, who were local Greeks, who themselves were actually subject to Roman rule, suddenly realized the significance of the error and feared for their own lives. Sha'ul, in his typically bold manner, demanded that they admit to their error and give a full public apology. Rather than being quietly escorted out of town, they were to be given a public apology and politely asked to leave in peace. However, rather than going quietly, they went to Lydia's house and encouraged the faithful brothers. Sha'ul, for the rest of his life, had a particularly strong bond with the community of Philippi and visited them on his third journey. He wrote to the Philippi community while he was under house arrest in Rome, while he was awaiting for trial before Emperor Nero. "I thank my God every time I think of you." Clearly, Sha'ul maintained a close bond with the community in Philippi, and in return they supported him financially throughout his travels. Having finally made an honourable departure from Philippi, Sha'ul and his team travelled inland, passing through 2 towns before coming to Thessalonica. They found the local synagogue and attended the services there in 3 consecutive Shabbats. On each occasion, Sha'ul was invited to give a drash or teaching from the Tanakh. As chapter 17, verses 3 and 4 suggest, he explained the significance of Yeshua as the promised Mashiach, or Messiah, spoken about many times in the Tanakh. He showed how Yeshua had to die and rise again. His messages were well received by many Jews and God-fearing Gentiles, including many of the leading women of the local community. But as always, a group of unbelieving Jews who had rejected Sha'ul and what he was saying. But as always, a group of unbelieving Jews who had all rejected Sha'ul and what he was saying, led a group of synagogue members against Sha'ul and Sila and wanted them removed from the city. Finally, in desperation, the rebellious Jews solicited the support and induced a riot. The incitement was directed at the house of a Messianic brother named Jason, who was providing accommodation for Sha'ul and his team. They hoped to have Sha'ul and Sila dragged out into the street. When they did not appear, the mob dragged Jason and the other Messianic brothers before the city authorities. The argument the rebellious Jews put forward was that Sha'ul and Sila were claiming a new king was standing in place of the Roman emperor. Being a city of Hellenistic pagans who had descended from the Seleucids, the Jewish king to rise up was something that was completely unbearable. The city was thrown into a state of complete confusion and turmoil. So Jason finally posted a bond of release for Sha'ul and Sila. Finally, the authorities agreed to let them go. So under the cover of darkness, they escaped from Thessalonica and headed down the road to Berea. That was a distance of about 75 kilometers. Luke says in chapter 17, verse 12, as soon as they arrived, they did the same thing as usual. They went to the synagogue. That was so typical of Sha'ul. In spite of all that had happened in many of the places that he had visited, he still put the Jew first. So in Berea was no exception. However, as in verse 11 and 12 says, now the people there were more noble in character than those in Thessalonica. They eagerly welcomed the message, checked it out in the Tanakh, and saw that everything that Sha'ul was saying was true. Many of them came to trust, as did a number of prominent Greek women. That must have been a refreshing change for Sha'ul to be so well received by both Jews and Gentiles alike. However, it did not take long before the Jews of Thessalonica got wind of what was happening in Berea. So the agitators were dispatched to Berea with the sole purpose of stirring up doubts in the minds of the local people. When Sha'ul's team heard the troublemakers had arrived, they whisked Sha'ul away down to the coast and put him on a boat and set sail for Athens, while Sila and Timothy remained in Berea. That brings us to chapter 17, verse 15, where I want to leave it for today. We will continue our journey next Shabbat with Sha'ul sharing his message about Yeshua in the very heart of the ancient Hellenistic capital of Athens. So what can we take away from today's session? We have seen over and over the tenacity of Sha'ul in every place he visited. He always went to the synagogue as soon as he arrived in a new city. It was always to the Jew first to share the good news about Yeshua. He circumcised Timothy only because he would have been rejected by the unbelieving Jews in the new cities if they knew he was an uncircumcised Jew. We have also seen how through most his journeys, Luke records the events by saying we when he's referring to the team, which suggests that he, Luke, was also part of the team as a reporter and the physician for the journey. We also saw how the Ruach HaKodesh prevented Sha'ul from speaking in the western regions of Anatolia. The reasons appeared to be because that territory was assigned to the outreach of Kepha, who in his first letter addressed the chosen people of the northern regions of Anatolia. We have also seen how Sha'ul was given a vision of how Yeshua wanted him to teach in Macedonia, which had previously been a territory of the Greek Empire. That is why so many of the God-fearing Gentiles were openly accepting his message, because they were descendants of the Seleucids, who had ruled after Alexander the Great from Antioch, Syria, as their capital. which of course was Sha'ul's home base. They were also pursued by the slave girl, who had the indwelling of a demonic snake spirit that caused considerable upset among the town folk, and who was still bound up, of course, in their ancient pagan traditional worship, and also the Hellenism of the former Greek Empire. Even the city and townsfolk and the body of believing Jews were already challenging Sha'ul, and either had him removed from the cities, or chained, or even stoned. And that pattern lasted throughout the life of Sha'ul, starting in Damascus after his encounter with Yeshua, right through to the time of house arrest in Rome. Sha'ul truly was an emissary to the Gentile world. So next week we'll continue following Sha'ul as he sails down the coast of Macedonia towards Athens as the capital of Greece, the place where the teachings of Hellenism originated. So, until that time, as always, Shabbat Shalom.